Morse here from Left Right Radio. What is the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? Obviously, a lot has been said about it since the Parkland school shooting. Today, you have former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens writing a column, an editorial in the New York Times, where he's called for rescinding the Second Amendment. He's suggesting that the young people protesting in the aftermath of this Parkland shooting focus on lobbying the legislators to actually rescind the Second Amendment. So let's just take a brief look at what is the Second Amendment and why is it important, because there's a lot of misinformation out there today, particularly from liberal talk show hosts, etc. The Second Amendment to the Constitution reads as follows: a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, I've heard a left-wing radio host this morning say that conservatives don't like to talk about the part of the Second Amendment that says a well-regulated militia. And there's been a claim made by Justice John Paul Stevens, one rejected by the majority in the Supreme Court, that this was a reference to concern on the part of the states at the time of the establishment of the American Republic that a standing army might threaten to occupy the states. So they put that in. And that's his interpretation. That's been widely disputed, widely debated. What my understanding is, and by the way, I don't think conservatives are trying to avoid this part of the amendment at all. What a well-regulated militia meant to the founding fathers, and what it still means, is that all males 18 and up, I think it might have even been 16 and up, I'm not sure the age, who are citizens and who frankly are white, have a right to keep and bear arms, that they are the militia. There were no militias in the formal sense. I've heard people say, well, what about the National Guard? The National Guard system wasn't established until the 1890s, so that's 100 years later. The founding generation considered well-regulated militia to be law-abiding white American males, age 18 and up. That was the well-regulated militia. They would have a right to keep and bear arms because they were law-abiding. They were regulated as such. That didn't mean that they had a right to own weapons like cannon. The argument has been made, even by some people on the right, but certainly by left-wingers, that that doesn't mean you can own like a nuclear device, and that's true. Military weaponry like cannon were not available to the average citizens. Arms were basically small arms that one could carry on their shoulder or carry in public, or however. And it was not military gear. Which means way that would translate today is that that doesn't mean you can own a Sherman tank, or various military grade weapons. And that does bring in question the business of whether or not the AR-15 or other semi-automatic weapons ought to be regulated. That's a legitimate conversation to have, in my opinion. But the fact is that a well-regulated militia simply means law-abiding adults. And of course, the franchise was expanded over time to include African Americans and women. As we became more enfranchised as a nation, as our citizenship expanded to include more people, which is a natural progression in a free country. And so today, a well-regulated militia is any American citizen over the age of 18 who is law-abiding. In other words, it doesn't have a criminal record, isn't a former convict. And that's the essence of it. That's what a well-regulated militia is. Then they have a right to keep and bear arms. And by the way, the shooter in Parkland High School, he apparently benefited from a program that was created by Obama and former Attorney General Eric Holder, called Operation Promise, I guess, that essentially expunged the criminal records of students because it was the idea, particularly to help minorities graduate from high school without a record, so they wouldn't have a criminal record to saddle their futures. All right. So the fact is that because of this crazy law, which really doesn't help anybody, it's the fact is that because of that, this guy Cruz was able to have no record, so he could purchase a weapon. If he had had a record, and if there were proper background checks in place, which is something that I think everyone supports, he wouldn't have been able to have gotten the weapons, or at least it would have been more difficult. And he was apprehended several times by police because he was assaulting his mother, apparently. I mean, the guy, everyone knew the guy was a bad apple. I mean, he was a criminal, but his record was expunged because of this, utopian Obama idea. Getting back to the Second Amendment, I heard criticism this morning from former Boston Globe writer Charlie Pierce, left-wing guy, way out there. He was on with Stephanie Miller, one of the most insulting programs I've ever heard on progressive radio. And he was saying that the conservatives have this fantasy that we have to keep and bear arms in order to avoid the development of a tyrannical government, something that did not exist at the time of the founding of the Republic, and that is ridiculous, he says. Well, first of all, it's not ridiculous. Whether it was the explicit intent of the Constitution, which, by the way, does not grant rights, it only recognizes God-given rights, existing rights, or whether it was just a part of the general understanding of the country, that was the belief system at the time. Keeping and bearing arms was viewed not just as a natural means of checking and balancing government power on the state or federal level, but yes, as a last resort in case a tyrannical government tried to take over the country. This was part, you see, the American system, our constitutional system, the political theory behind it, the philosophy of it, is a system of checks and balances. It's a diffusion of powers into various areas so that one power would basically check and balance the excesses of another power. And thus, the theory held that the real power would remain in its rightful place, the sovereign citizen under God, not the state. And so in the formal sense, the Constitution, the bulk of the Constitution, divides the federal government into three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Each of those branches has a very specific and delineated role in governing. Each of those branches has within it a means to check excesses from the other two branches. There's the veto power on the part of the executive. There's the override of a veto on the part of the Congress. There is the judicial power on the part of the Supreme Court to stop unconstitutional usurpations by the other two. So they keep each other in check, and thus the power is diffused. It isn't coordinated into the hands of any one group or one person. And the further check and balance was the balance between the federal government and the states. And then the states had their own system of checks and balances. You have a governor, you have a state legislature, you've got a state court system. And then from there, you had the local government, the sheriffs, the heads of the counties, who were considered the highest law enforcement officer in the land. They would balance state power and federal power, I suppose. And then the local communities, they would have their mayors, their local councils, their local school boards, and their local governments, all balancing each other and balancing the power of the states. So you have a system, an intricate and system of checks and balances that goes all the way from the federal level down to the local level. But more fundamentally, the recognition of the Second Amendment in particular, and some of the other amendments as well, is a further expansion of this balance of power, because the right of the citizen to keep and bear arms balances federal and state power. It's just part of the system. If the federal and state governments know that the citizen is armed or may be armed, they are not going to be as likely to exercise police power, because they know that there's someone on the other side of the door that might have a weapon. They can defend themselves and their families. And so a citizenry that keeps and bear arms is a citizen that is balancing state and federal power. That's just a fact. Whether or not it's legally codified into our laws is really almost beside the point, even though it is and has been recognized by successive court decisions on the federal and state level. The fact is that in the de facto sense, that is exactly what the Second Amendment does, to defend themselves, not only against personal assault and crime, but also against political assault and tyranny. The example has been raised many times that had the Jewish people in Germany had weapons, there may not have been a Holocaust. Now, I don't know if it would have stopped the Holocaust, but the fact of the matter is that all Germans were disarmed during the Weimar Republic period because of the street clashes between the two socialist thug groups, the communists and the Nazis. And so the Weimar government instituted a law ordering all people to turn in their weapons because they promised peace and safety, right? The result was that when the Nazis took over and they decided to, come in and break the door down and apprehend their enemies, whether they be Jews or whether they be German dissidents or whoever they didn't like, they knew that they could do this without worrying about the possibility that on the other side of the door might be a father holding a gun that could shoot them, because they didn't have guns. So they had a monopoly on guns. The government was fully armed, and they maintained this monopoly. And they set up a state police entity called the Gestapo, which was modeled after the Soviet entity called the Cheka, and which was an entirely socialistic development. It's another subject for another day. But the point is that had people had arms, they could have defended themselves. They could have fought the Nazis. They could have gone into the woods and formed militias and fought back. I remember a couple of years ago, I interviewed a man who was fighting in the partisan groups in Poland during the World War II. After the war, he emigrated to Israel. And they did some incredible things fighting Nazis in Poland, occupying Nazis, shooting Nazis, liberating death camps. Just an incredible story. And he said that the two things that they did not have enough of were food and guns. Had they had more access to guns, they could have launched a much stronger, much more vigorous resistance. And the Nazis would not have gotten as far as they did, I would argue. Same thing with the communists in Russia. They would never have been able to have murdered upwards of 25, 30 million people if the people had been armed. But the fact of the matter is that arms were rare, and I don't think the Tsar's government really was that much pro Second Amendment. I mean, allowing people to keep them